Okay, so now we're going to talk about hosting platforms. So there's a lot of misunderstanding when it comes to podcasters, especially when it comes to first-time podcasters, because a lot of podcasters till they believe that when they record their podcast, that they can go to the final player point. So that player point may be Amazon Podcasts, or it may be Spotify, or it may be Google Podcasts, and that they can upload their files directly into these final avenues. When that's very far from the truth. That's not correct whatsoever. And that's essentially because what you need is you need a podcast host. Now just think about the podcast host as what sits between the creators like yourself that are making podcasts and platforms where consumption takes place, because there's so many platforms, and the more widely distributed you are, the better it is. And how cumbersome would it be if you had to go and upload your podcast into all of these different avenues? And most of them, 99% of them don't even have that capability. So they don't allow you to upload your podcast. So a lot of creators get confused at this point. So it goes back to the word podcast itself. So the word podcast is actually a derivative of the word broadcast. So for something to be broadcasted, you need it to exist in one place, and you need it to be broadcasted to many places, right? And that is what a hosting platform is. Think about your hosting platform as your broadcaster. What I actually like to think about a hosting platform as is as the home of your podcast, with all of the information, all of this different information with regards to the name of your podcast, the categories of your podcast that we've discussed, the show notes of your podcast, the episodes themselves, any edits that you want to make, everything, your analytics of your podcast, that will sit right here. So we already talked about, the fact that within Hubhopper, you are able to record your podcast and edit your podcast. But the fundamental reason for Hubhopper's existence is because Hubhopper is the home of a podcast. And Hubhopper is a hosting platform. So it hosts your podcast like somebody who's throwing a party and is essentially hosting that party. So what essentially happens is that when you create your podcast on a hosting platform, I'm just trying to explain the dynamics of how this works. The hosting platform will automatically create something called an RSS feed. Now, an RSS feed stands for really simple syndication. Think about it as a link, and this link has all of the information of your podcast. Every single thing that we have just talked about, that includes your podcast name, your episode name, which is your first episode, second episode, which episode has which show notes, which episode has which cover art, which your podcast cover art itself, your author name, your category name, it's all stored directly into the RSS feed. So think about your RSS feed as your podcast identity or its name. Now the hosting platform actually will distribute this RSS feed into all of the consumption side platforms. So we'll distribute it across Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, across JioSaavn, Ghana, a plethora of different platforms. And what Hubhopper's actually done here is we've done something very interesting where we have taken the platforms that are already globally present and we distribute you into those platforms, which then ingest your show and showcase your show. And then they're consistent across all of these different platforms. But we've also integrated with a lot of exclusive platforms, especially for emerging market creators, so that your podcast can reach people who otherwise wouldn't have ever come across your podcast. So most of the platforms in the Asian market or in the South Asian market are to a degree powered by Hubhopper because of the fact that we distribute them to listeners in avenues where they otherwise wouldn't be getting podcasts. So platforms like Daily Hunt, platforms like Paytm, and a whole host of others. So essentially, think about a hosting platform as the home of your podcast and the distributor, the broadcaster of your podcast and it broadcasts by utilizing the RSS feed. Now, once this essentially happens, the other benefit that the host has is that because the host has distributed your show across all of these avenues, it is able to collect all of this show's data in terms of how the show has been doing. So being able to track your streams on episode basis, on an overall podcast basis, where people are listening from, what devices are people listening on, which player do they like. So it gives you a large amount of podcast intelligence, and this comes under the section of your podcast analytics. Since this is essentially a host also provides you with a bunch of other benefits. So a host provides you with the ability to automatically take that podcast of yours and create a podcast website, which is your own domain and is your own home for your podcast. So that's normally called a pod site. If you already have a website, the hosting platform, any good hosting platform will give you embedded players, which you can just stick to the bottom of your websites, and there's no code required in either creating a pod site or creating an embedded player. And you can make your platforms playback friendly by using embedded players, and hosting platforms do a whole lot of other stuff. But at its fundamental core, just think about the hosting platform as the home of your podcast that sits between you, the creator, platforms where consumption needs to take place. The hosting platform will distribute you into all of these places. Will make sure if you're making any edits, automatically those edits are going to be reflected across all platforms. If you're adding any new episodes, they will automatically be reflected across all platforms. And when consumption takes place, all of your analytics in following IAB analytics guidelines are showcased to you within your podcast analytics section within the platform. And then the hosting platform will provide you a whole host of other benefits as well, including things like customer support, etc., etc. But I hope this clarifies for you that this isn't a game of two entities where there's the creator creating the podcast and then there are the end consumption platforms. There needs to sit a broadcaster for your podcast, a home for your podcast, which is called a hosting platform, which hosts your show. Think about it as the individual that's trying to put this entire party together, and that will send all of your information to different platforms and gather all of the information back for you to look at and to improve upon your podcast from. So yes, I hope that helps. And next, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how to set up your account and basically take you step by step. It's extremely easy. So I'd say you already covered the hardest parts of podcasting. Now you're just on your way to celebrating the launch of your show. So looking forward to the next one.